Drinking places were public places where everyone could gather, and most people went to taverns because it was the only public place they were allowed to enter. And a good amount of trade went on in taverns, and the tavern was also used as the bank. Business was not so much about money, but about social relationships, and deals could be sealed with a healthy toast, witnessed by the gathering and recorded in their memories. And taverns were for local people, while inns were for places where travelers could drink. The very rich or the very poor could knock on the door of the huge private estates in England to seek shelter for the night, but the middle class were usually turned away because the landed gentry didn't want to deprive the innkeepers of business. The law required that an innkeeper accept all travelers who knocked, even at a very late hour, because it was not safe to be turned away without shelter at the end of the day, and so innkeepers were protected by the law because they were doing a noble work, serving the public without discrimination and supplying a good service at a fair price. When given a key to a room, by law any responsibility was no longer the innkeeper's, and some large houses would rent separate rooms, but they were not innkeepers. Instead, they were landlords, and these boarding houses were exempt from the innkeeper's code, but operated under laws governing landlords. The innkeeper and his family had their own rooms, while everyone else slept in the main hall, and an innkeeper housed transients on their way from one place to another, so Jesus had been born in a barn according to the code of innkeepers, and people who did not belong at inns could go to a tavern instead. The upper classes tried to control the consumption of alcohol outside the boarding houses and inns by licensing the taverns, but over the years alcohol became cheaper and cheaper to sell, and there was always someone within walking distance who was in the alcohol business. Those who drank publicly were usually the poor, and criminals would use alcohol to get up the courage to carry out their crimes. The streets, it was often said, belonged to the poor, and they behaved in them pretty much as they pleased. They jostled their betters and jeered at foreigners. They dominated Tyburn hangings and took charge of the pillory. They frequented hundreds of rookeries, cheap taverns, and underworld amusement places. They turned Sundays into, quote, days of riot, excursion, and dissipation, close quote. A cry like Wilkes and Liberty could dump them pell-mell into the streets, menacing, vociferating, exulting. Kings and Desperate Men, Life in 18th Century England by Louis Kronenberger, New York, Vintage Books, Alfred A. Knopf, Incorporated, and Random House, Incorporated, 1942, page 252 and 3. Prison life was beyond description. There were instances of prisoners thrown into dungeons lying over sewers full of corpses. In such an atmosphere, epidemics of jail fever easily followed. Kings and Desperate Men, page 95. Henry II had been the first to tax beer in the 12th century, and it had been a steady source of revenue ever since. And while beer was the beverage of choice for the common Englishman, with the rise of technology the commoner began to drink gin instead of beer. Gin had come from the Netherlands, where it had been called Geneva brandy, and the gin was made from juniper berries that were thought to be medicinal, and drinking gin for its health effects killed many Londoners from 1720 to 1751, and they began drinking gin in earnest because the water had become deadly with cholera. The cholera had first come from India, brought in on the ships of the British East India Company, and it took from 2 hours to 5 days for the cholera microbes to take hold, and its victims would become so dehydrated that they would turn blue, so it was called the Blue Death. It would not be until 1850 that John Snow would remove the handle of the water pump in the public square at Soho, to prove that water transmission rather than air miasma was the mechanism by which cholera was spread. It would take another generation for that phenomenon to become known, since the authorities considered such a reality distasteful and actively worked to suppress the discovery that water tainted with sewage was how the cholera bacteria spread into murderous epidemics. Although the British East India Company was governing the largest population of the world in India, A tiny bacterium in the water could bring them to their knees, killing tens of thousands at a time, wherever the trading ships carried the cholera. In India, people became more susceptible to illness as they were displaced from their rural farms to work on plantations or in factories, and although filtering water through their silk saris and spreading the silk cloth in the sun had been a cheap and effective means of stopping the spread of cholera, adding a shot of alcohol to the water also killed the bacteria. While the beer and ale being made in England was at most 15% alcohol and was comparable to wine, the gin being made in Holland topped out at 50%. And because the English had been in constant competition with the Dutch for supremacy of trade in the seven seas, the English brought over William of Orange from Holland in 1688 to put an end to the Anglo-Dutch wars. The result was that the London slums were flooded with the importation of gin from Holland, and with the drinking of gin, steadily London became more lawless, the Mohawk outbreaks of a generation back isolated and prankish, whereas nothing compared to the forays of determined ruffians, the systematic invasions of thieves and robbers, the drunken crimes of starving and homeless men. They wholly overawed the constables and the police, who slunk by them, warrants in pocket. In any clash of arms it was the desperadoes who won. More often than not, the constables hugged the warmth of beer-houses, or, when it seemed urgent to make some arrests, arrested innocent people. The very constabulary, indeed, were as lawless when drunk as the men they were hired to hunt down. Even when sober, they indulged in petty thefts and any possible form of blackmail. Kings and Desperate Men, page 93. The poverty of the working class inspired Tom Paine to write books, and Paine was Irish and madder than hell that Catholics were treated like dirt in England, thanks to Henry VIII. When George IV became king in 1820, he kept Britain as aristocratic as possible, and watchmen were replaced by policemen in 1829, and that was the year the English discovered that beer and gin contained the same sort of alcohol. The women's temperance unions started up in 1874 and took aim at the drunken Irish, as well as drunken factory workers, where people were laboring indoors for a change rather than having to fortify themselves with alcohol against the cold. But temperance was mainly concerned with the plague of poverty, and not necessarily with abandoning alcohol altogether. The Crown didn't bother to encourage the temperance crusaders because taxing alcohol and selling licenses was dependable revenue, while religious people thought the temperance movement was substituting a secular crusade for divine matters. The teetotalers had an aspiring social message, hinting at their superior status by pointing to the lives of people below them, and people would take the pledge, not out of religious belief, but to improve their standing in society. The teetotalers were usually drinkers who saw themselves as above the poor people they wanted to help, and they came from the upper classes and had no idea how the lower classes lived. The temperance movement in England was not about helping the poor drunken folk, but about explaining poverty as something that resulted from people spending too much of their money on alcohol, not because they were being paid low wages, but because they didn't have the fortitude to stay within a budget. Temperance was not about alcohol so much as it was about the cultivation of virtue and good manners, and a drunk person at one of their temperance meetings was unthinkable. The largely static condition of the 18th century London poor resulted from the largely static 18th century attitude towards poverty. In the benighted 17th century, the chief explanation of poverty had been low wages. With the coming of the Age of Reason, however, this view collapsed, and by Queen Anne's time the cry had gone up that working men's wages were not too low but too high, and that poverty arose from the thriftlessness of the workers themselves. This widespread opinion, implying that laborers squandered their money in taverns and worked only when they had to, was promulgated by so observant a writer as Defoe. The 18th century suddenly thought it had found a panacea for all its economic evils in the creation of the workhouse. Anyone in need who refused to enter one forfeited his right to relief, and the community could wash his hands of him. For all that, many refused to enter. Workhouse living was harsh and workhouse management corrupt, while vermin and jail fever were almost as common in the London workhouses as in the London jails. Kings and Desperate Men, page 245 and 6. Because of the horror of London prisons, the English started shipping prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean to Georgia. The penal code had been shocking at the beginning of the century, and as the century advanced it grew worse. And the penal code was not only harsh, it was absurd. When the 19th century dawned, stealing a sheep or horse was still a crime punishable by death. So was taking linen from a bleaching ground. So was cutting down trees in a garden. So was picking a pocket for anything above a shilling. So was breaking the border of a fish pond so the fish could escape. On the other hand, if a man attempted his father's life, it was only a misdemeanor. Again, to steal fruit already gathered was punishable by death, but to gather fruit and then steal it was only a trespass. To break into a house at 5 p.m. in winter was a capital offense, but to break into a house at 5 a.m. in summer was not. However much England might pride itself on its form of government, its penal code was the most vicious and sanguinary in Europe. Kings and Desperate Men, page 247 and 8. Fortunately, in England, the disease was partly its own cure. The laws were too severe for juries to be willing to enforce them. Rather than send men to their deaths for trifling offences, jurors, in full sight of their guilt, acquitted them. The trial, in any case, seldom lasted long. 1 day at most was the general custom. The law could not be burdened with the cost of a long trial, and jurors could not be bored with the annoyance of it. They ate in the jury box and drank and got drunk. Drunk or sober, they fell asleep, and often woke up to be talked by their fellows into any sort of verdict. A few very bad laws were, however, repealed. Prisoners who refused to plead could no longer be pressed to death, and women who murdered their husbands were at length sent to the gallows instead of the stake. Kings and Desperate Men, page 248 and 9. It was no wonder that so many English prisoners had been willing to accept transportation to the colonies as punishment for their poverty. And it was also no accident that the 13 colonies had begun to form 7 years after the British East India Company was granted its first charter in 1600. Most of the colonies had begun as joint stock or corporate ventures, and they'd learned from British East India executives how to prepare for the common defense as early as 1640. While the Democrats continued to think it best to be governed by a king who would allow them to vote for figurehead governors who would not require that they govern themselves. The problem for Americans falling outside the British colonial model was that so many disparate factions were allowed to vote in elections in America, and these included not only the rich and the poor, the merchants and the farmers, the Catholics and the Protestants, but also the Scotch and the Irish and the Germans and the Russians and the Swedes, so the American colonies were not so easy to govern as other British colonies that had a more heterogeneous population. The American War of Independence became inevitable because the Republicans insisted on equality and freedom, and the Americans especially enjoyed gathering in taverns where politics was always the topic of the day. Over in England, less than 1% of the population were allowed to vote, while the majority of Americans were eligible to cast a ballot, and they not only elected their governors, but also elected the local judges, and they voted while serving on juries, and the vibrant American courts enjoyed keeping the legal professionals well employed. The senior members of the British East India Company had been practicing voting behind closed doors for many years, and they had learned from experience that 13 was the magic number for a functioning board with its quorum call of 9 seats. The first board of the BEIC had a 9-member board requiring 6 members for a quorum and 4 votes to initiate action. So the first British East India Company flag had 9 stripes, but when they were given their first charter by Queen Elizabeth in 1600, they expanded the board to 13 seats in order to comply with English corporate law, and the flag was updated to show 13 stripes. The American flag would be taken from that of the British East India Company, with the British canton replaced by stars representing the separate states of the Union, and the number of stripes reflected the number of states required to optimize the fairness of what the BEIC had accomplished with the success of their business, ruled by a voting body rather than being given directives from a monarchical overlord. When the East India began with a 9-member board, a quorum call meant that enough officers needed to show up to vote, so that a 2/3 majority voting aye could not be overturned if those not present for the vote were asked to place their ballots of no alongside the noes from the initial vote, and that total would not be enough to overturn by 2/3 the original ayes, which just so happened to be a total of 4 persons. The original stamp or seal of the BEIC had been a heart surrounding the letters EIC, and the number 4 planted in the cleft of the heart as if it were a flag or a standard, and the original flag had 9 stripes representing the 9 members of the board. The design of the flag of the United States was meant to show that America was self-governing just as the British East India Company was independent before the Crimean War would put an end to their prosperity, and the Americans had believed that a bond with the British East India Company with their shared desire to oppose crown taxes would help win the American War of Independence, especially because the BEIC had its own private army that was twice the size of the army of King George. In response to the Americans being friendly with the British East India Company, the Crown passed the Regulating Act of 1773 that put a 3-member commission above the board of the East India Company to force them to resume payment of the yearly £400,000 due the British Crown that the East India Company was claiming they could no longer afford due to the Americans refusing to buy their tea. The colonists were buying Dutch tea instead, cheaper because it was less heavily taxed, and the BEIC asked the Crown if they could bypass England altogether. So to keep the BEIC from making an alliance with the American colonists, the Crown passed the Tea Act on the 10th of May in 1773. The Tea Act bought up all the oversupply of tea being stored in BEIC warehouses that the Americans were refusing to buy, and the following month the Regulating Act prevented the BEIC from being able to make any trade deals with the Americans. The Crown flooded the colonies with the tea from the BEIC warehouses at a price so low that the Americans would be enticed to buy from King George, and that was supposed to put all the other tea importers out of business, but the Patriots stuck to their boycott of British tea, and the colonists dumped the cheap British tea into the harbor on the 16th of December in 1773. The following year, 12 of the 13 colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress, after the British had blockaded the sea lanes so American fishing boats were forced to stay in harbor. And at the first Continental Congress, the colonists drew up a petition to the king to redress their grievances. But the message was delayed in transmission, as messages often are, and the petition had blamed the king's governors for mismanagement rather than the king himself. The second article in the petition required that all ships importing Africans into America be banned, and when the Crown responded inadequately to the Americans' clumsy Clumsy demands. The Second Continental Congress convened on the 10th of May in 1775 to declare war on Britain, and this time Georgia showed up, because by then it had turned into a shooting war. The Declaration of Independence passed the Continental Congress on the 4th of July in 1776, and all 13 colonies were required to sign off on the establishment of the Constitution of the United States. And after its founding, the Senate would require the same 2/3 majority as had been shown to ensure success by the board of the British East India Company, whose flag they were proud to emulate. As the 13 American colonies had grown and begun to engage in trade, they'd not only followed the advice of their friends and associates within the British East India Company, but had striven for the same freedom and independence of the BEIC, and in so doing, the colonists had become republicans and had established the same number of governors needed to function in their Continental Congress, readily adopting and proudly flying the new national flag associated to the BEIC. Early on, the United States was divided by the country folk who governed themselves on the one hand versus the city people who were attracted to the royal court and its courtesans. While all Americans were impressed by a good, well-run business enterprise, because before FDR came along with his New Deal, there was no such thing as a free lunch. To make up for the loss of the American colonies, the Crown doubled the tax on alcohol in England, and by the 19th century, alcohol production had become one of the largest businesses in England and provided 10% of the jobs. Shopkeepers would step out for a pint of beer several times a day, and everyone used the yeast from the breweries to bake their bread, and 1/3 of the government's revenue came from taxing alcohol. The Crown relied on alcohol to entice young men to join the military, since military life was so awful that only someone under the influence would sign up. And the British stayed in the practice of flogging their soldiers and sailors right up until the Great War. Many soldiers were stationed in drinking houses as an alternative to keeping them in private homes, and the British Navy would continue to hand out a rum ration that would not be abolished until 1970. Temperance in England got a boost from conscientious people agitating against slavery, and factory wages were being kept lower in 1830 by the slave-produced cotton running through English mills, so factory owners were blaming alcohol for the poverty of factory employees in order to maximize profits. The temperance speeches gave people a good scare, not unlike modern monster movies, and many temperance speeches veered deliciously towards the subject of the sinful cities. Hard-up parsons, many of them actually in prison for debt, ground out a livelihood by uniting helpless and speechless bridegrooms to eager and spotty brides. Young men down from the universities would, in the fury of drink or passion, be hurried along to the clergymen who officiated at almost every street corner. Kings and Desperate Men, page 93. The temperance movement was given a big push from the people importing coffee, and the first coffee had been brought to England in 1652, and tea had still been new in 1611, and chocolate would be a luxury for many more decades. Garraway's Coffee House in London hosted the first stock exchange, where they would light a candle and take bids until the flame sputtered out, and this was called buying by the candle. And the stock traders made an obscene amount of money, and would send some of their profits towards the temperance people, who well knew that drinking was not limited to the lower classes. And whatever men's purpose in coming together, drink would keep them there. Never before or since has upper-class England drunk so hard. It was almost obligatory to be a 2 or 3 bottle man at any single session. The inconspicuous Methuen Treaty with Portugal in 1703 began an era in English history which has yet to end. It signified circulate the port on a giant scale. Under Anne, port put claret and burgundy in the shade. Kings and Desperate Men, page 61. The Methuen Treaty was also called the Port Wine Treaty, and it was signed 2 days after Christmas in 1703, allowing Portuguese wine into England with a lower tax than French wines. The Romans had called the country of Portugal Portus Calais, and its ancient name was Lusitania. And the city of Oporto was named after the rich red wine that blessed Portugal, and the popularity of their port wine made the name Portugal stick. Portugal was 350 miles long along the western coast of Spain, and it was 70 miles wide, with the onshore sea breezes calming the hot climate of Spain, so that snow fell in the northern Portuguese mountains, while the rest of the country enjoyed abundant rainfall, nurturing an abundance of vegetation in an ideal climate. A series of forts protect the seaward approaches. The harbor is one of the finest in the world, well sheltered, deep close to the quays, and capacious enough to hold all the navies of Europe at once. The Circle of Knowledge, Essential Facts of Everyday Interest, Editor-in-Chief Henry W. Ruoff, Boston, The Standard Publication Company, 1916-1920, page 561. A port was where people went to get more port after looking through a porthole from a portly ship turning to port, and they might portend that the port wine was portable enough to be portative, so they would comport themselves through the portamento, where an imported portrait portraying a portion of Portland might hang in the portico, and the English language developed in drawing rooms over glasses of port. A poet born in 1793 named John Clare used colloquial English including the words bodily, croodling, dither, dizen, hing, herd, mort, peep, pingle, pleachy, pooty, prog, shanny, shule, swell, swee, swoof, tunky, wimmy, and wopstraw. The variety of their interests and amusements is staggering. There were not simply bookish lords at home in one another's libraries, or rakish lords who stole one another's mistresses and exchanged tales of conquest over a fourth bottle, or horsey lords stamping about their stables and scrutinizing next month's card at Newmarket, or political-minded lords who devoted their lives to safeguarding the future of England. Nor was it that one man of brilliant parts drank too much, and another whored too much, and another gambled too much. Without giving sleep a thought, any of a dozen men might go round the clock, transacting business over breakfast, galloping for 2 hours of a morning in the park, waiting on a great lady in her boudoir, translating a satire of Juvenal before afternoon dinner, drinking 2 bottles of port before he rose from the table, exchanging impromptu verses at Buttons or White's, holding Parliament spellbound for an hour and a half, and when the House rose at midnight, managing a hoax or brawl before banging on some courtesan's door to stay with her till dawn. Kings and Desperate Men, page 58 and 9. While the English were enjoying themselves, the Frenchman Rousseau was writing about the, quote, natural man, prompting the French to stop wearing powdered wigs, and the French began wearing hairstyles that were more plain. And Rousseau and his friends came up with the idea that God expressed himself in the concept of nature, that God was not interested in the wealth of the divinely appointed nobility. These romantic thinkers created the phrase, quote, consent of the governed, close quote, when they heard stories about American Indians, and the natural spirit of American Indians would inspire the French Revolution and force the British to put the plug in the jug long enough to defeat Napoleon. The French thought that the American Indians were children of nature, and so they wrote romantically about them, thinking that Indians were living in freedom and equality, and for the Romantics, every person was ascribed by the Creator with certain natural, inalienable rights, and Jefferson would use these French ideas when writing the American Declaration of Independence. The Pilgrims had sailed west in 1620 to find a more pure environment in which to worship their Creator, and the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact while they were still on board the ship, giving themselves the benefits and curses of self-government. In 1639, the Reverend Hooker, doing the best he could at the time, wrote the first American Constitution, and his Pilgrims held town meetings where they would vote to decide what to do, and to vote required belonging to a certain religion and having a certain amount of money, and religious freedom meant it didn't matter what church you belonged to, as long as you belonged to some church, and an honest, God-fearing one. The Portuguese had been the first to sail away in search of other Christians to help them fight Islamic invaders, and Vasco da Gama had sailed from Portugal to China in 1498 by going east around the end of Africa, and the wealth that Portugal would amass in selling port to the English would give them enough leeway that they no longer had to work very hard at ocean voyaging in search of further fortune. While the rest of the world forged ahead with the industrial age, Portugal remained quiet and lovely, concentrating on becoming the best hosteliers in the world. Most Americans remained poor country folk with little foreign trade, and they bartered instead of using money, and clothes or shoes would be sold for a bottle of whiskey, but the more they used it for trade, the cheaper the whiskey got. And when Congress finally taxed corn liquor, people could not afford the tax, so they would have a whiskey rebellion in 1791. Hamilton had been the one to suggest the whiskey tax, and had told Washington to use the military to enforce it against American civilians, and 13,000 troops were sent to crack down on a handful of moonshiners who had burned down a tax collector's house. And the whiskey makers said they'd go ahead and pay the tax if the government wanted to make such a fuss. Robert E. Lee's father led the troops to stop the whiskey rebellion, and nobody was injured, so no harm was done. And the militia sat down with the moonshiners to sample the product, and Hamilton had a group of the farmers arrested just to make it look good. Hamilton brought them back to Philadelphia and marched them down the center of town, wearing signs that said "Insurgent," and 2 were convicted of treason, but George Washington immediately pardoned them, and everyone went home happy. The whiskey tax was stopped in 1802 as soon as the Revolutionary War debt was paid, and alcohol would not be taxed again until it was started up again to pay for the Civil War. Washington had used his own distillery, and 1798 had been Washington's most profitable year, after he was able to retire from public life and was free to stay home distilling alcohol. And one of the things George Washington gave the country was a great beer recipe. Most everyone had been libacious in early America, and Mr. Kobler listed a bill for some visiting ministers to a church in Hartford, Connecticut, saying they consumed mugs of flip and bitters, mugs and bowls of toddy, pints and bottles of wine, and bowls and more bowls of alcoholic punch. Mr. Kohler said that in 1729, one church group from Massachusetts managed to consume 6.5 barrels of hard cider, 25 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of brandy, and 4 gallons of rum. And Harvard University also had its own brewery, and many official occasions would become downright unruly. The major industry north of Pennsylvania was the manufacture of rum from imported molasses, and in the year before the American War of Independence, America drank 8 million gallons of rum. and the Continental Congress of 1774 had been a series of long feasts where punch, wine, porter, beer, claret, Madeira, and Burgundy were served in staggering amounts. Washington wrote a note to a carpenter named Green that he should, quote, refrain from drink which is the source of all evil and the ruin of half the workmen in the country, close quote. And then Washington hired him and promised him, in addition to regular wages, quote, $4 at Christmas, with which he may be drunk for 4 days and nights, $2 at Easter to effect the same purpose, $2 at Whitsuntide to be drunk for 2 days, a dram in the morning and a drink of grog at noon, close quote. The Washingtonians, an early 19th century confraternity of teetotalers, so named themselves after George Washington. It was an odd choice of patron hero, considering the first president's marked fondness for a drink. Ardent Spirits, page 31. Molasses was the prime ingredient in rum making, and molasses came from the French and Spanish islands in the Caribbean. And the New Englanders traded with the Caribbean islands for the plantation products of rum and molasses in exchange for fur and wood products, and before the American Revolution, a fifth of all imported alcohol was rum. Britain tried to tax the sale of molasses with the Sugar Act, and while the impressment of seamen was the primary cause of the American War of Independence, it was second only to the Crown's unreasonable taxes, and seamen were usually shanghaied under the influence of alcohol, and almost 10,000 Americans had been turned into impressed sailors. Up until the War of 1812, Americans made fabric, leather, and liquor in that order. And when America wanted to buy more commodities from England, especially molasses, there were tobacco and timber to pay for it. But America was always broke, and the American army was sometimes forced to do without their daily 4 ounces of rum. With this terrible suffering, they came up with alternatives to rum like pumpkin beer or spruce beer, and one of the first acts of Congress was to make sure all soldiers got their daily ration of alcohol. The American army would have collapsed if drinking were stopped before 1840, and during his 2 terms, President Jefferson bought over $10,000 worth of wine, and Benjamin Franklin wrote drinking songs such as, "For there can't be good living where there is not good drinking, while all that drink water deserve to be drowned." Ardent Spirits, page 34. 1/4 of Washington's household expenses went towards buying alcohol, and one of his army officers wrote a description of the president's drinking habits to stop the rumors that the chief executive was drinking too much, and the officer insisted Washington never drank more than a bottle a day besides rum, punch, and beer, due to the fact that cider, champagne, and brandy were not thought of as serious drinks. After the war, the marketplace changed when the French and British stopped selling molasses to America, and the New Englanders got out of the rum habit and instead drank apple cider and beer, and milk cost more than alcohol, and there were no refrigerators to store milk, and Abraham Lincoln's mother would die from drinking milk. Congress put a tax on alcohol that paid an entire third of the Revolutionary War debt, but the tax mostly applied to imported wine and rum made from imported molasses. So Americans turned to corn liquor to avoid the tax, and corn liquor became a currency that could be traded for commodities while the government left liquor made from apples alone. The tax Congress put on imports in 1783 made American rum makers insist that domestic corn liquor be taxed too, and the rum makers said that America would stop drinking rum altogether, and while the price of rum doubled with the new tax, America could afford it, because suddenly Europe was paying big bucks for any food America could send overseas as war raged in Europe because Napoleon was on the march. The British Crown had told George Washington that he was not allowed to sell tobacco for more than it cost to ship it over to England, so the Americans could no longer do business with England and were forced to govern themselves. Some of Washington's friends would smuggle his tobacco into England to sell on the streets, but the Crown got wind of it and sent redcoat soldiers over to put an end to the smuggling. The tax that the Crown put on English tea was meant to force the colonies to pay for the 7 Years' War. So Americans quit buying English tea, and the redcoats tried to sell it so cheaply that the Americans would want to buy it, but the Americans threw the tea into the harbor to keep the price of smuggled tea high enough that American tea smugglers could stay in business. And the Americans dressed up like Indians when they dumped the cheap tea into the harbor. At the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the peace treaty that was signed in Versailles in Paris forced France out of America, so England had owned everything east of the Mississippi River. Spain was given everything west of the Mississippi, and the mouth of the river at New Orleans allowed access to the sea, so whoever owned New Orleans ruled all the trade in the heartland of America. No matter that France no longer owned Louisiana, the French living there had stayed in New Orleans, telling the Spanish that it was Spanish territory, and turning around at the same time and telling the English that it belonged to England. So the French got along with the neighbors, and the French also stayed, because the King of France was the cousin of the King of Spain, and knew that both of them wouldn't really mind. When Spain gave Louisiana to France in 1801, and Napoleon was on the way over to visit his new property in America, he had to stop by Haiti to put down a slave revolt, where Napoleon and his soldiers became violently sick, and 30,000 of them were dying in Haiti of tropical diseases. Napoleon dropped anchor at New Orleans, but never made it ashore in America, turning back to France instead and selling Louisiana to the U.S. in 1803 for only $15 million. And Louisiana was everything west of the Mississippi, from New Orleans to Santa Fe to Montana, and the U.S. would have paid that much for the city of New Orleans alone. To keep the Americans out of the West, Spain had solicited the local Indians to do their dirty work, and the Indians had been more than willing. And Sutter's Indians had been Catholic and spoke Spanish, but no English. All the sundry tribes of Indians dressed differently and spoke different languages, and Sioux was a French word that meant snake in the grass. The Indians would have become horribly inbred from their tribal isolation if they hadn't been committing frequent raids on neighboring tribes, so warfare had been a cultural advantage for them, and the warrior mentality became inextricable from their national identity. The French had allowed giving alcohol to Indians for over 40 years. The French had outlawed giving alcohol to Indians for over 40 years on pain of death. But the Indians just started trading with the English instead, and the town tavern was usually the first target of Indian raids. The English would arrest them, which was easy to do because they were usually passed out drunk, and would deport them as slaves to the West Indies. Metacomet waged war over alcohol, and at first the colonists liked having the British Army do the dirty work when it came to Indians, but the settlers themselves finally killed Metacomet after his friends had murdered at least 10% of the settlers, and then they stuck his head on a pole and left it there for 25 years, and they did the same with his sister-in-law, Wettamoo. Pontiac managed to unite all the Indians from the Great Lakes to New Orleans against the English, but even he usually drank too much. Pontiac said that, quote, "If we dwelt near your old village of Detroit, our warriors would always be drunk," close quote. No sooner had he finished speaking than he ordered a barrel of rum broached to slake his own and his warriors' thirst. For a bribe of rum from an English trader, a Kaskaskia tribesmen overtook Pontiac in a wood a few years later and split his skull with a hatchet. Ardent Spirits, page 39. At any season, the arrival of Indians at a post meant a brawl. Even sober, they were the noisiest race. Squaws' casual conversation was in shouts and became fortissimo when there was work to do. Religious worship was at a roar with timpani, but was quieter than medical practice and a whisper compared to mourning. The Course of Empire, page 321. And nothing was as noisy as a drinking party. To erase the memory of defeat, to nerve them to make a fight, to get them to come to the post, to welcome them on arrival, to buy their loyalty, to keep it, to induce them to default on the credit they had had from the opposition, to put them in a mood for trade, to inflate the price of goods, to reward them for virtue, to express your everlasting admiration of their brave deeds, or because they drove you crazy begging for it, Ibid. When the settlers were massacred and their houses were burned, it was said by the Indians to have been just a few young braves acting under the influence of alcohol. So people were told over and over again not to give alcohol to Indians. Each tribe had their own horrifying primitive potions, and while the Indians in Southern California, New Mexico, and Arizona brewed some powerful stuff, only 1/3 of them were allowed to get wasted at a time, while the others acted as supervisors. When Spain had owned Florida, the Spanish had brought in plenty of alcohol, and Louis XIV had given up and torn up the Jesuit ban against alcohol, and Louis XIV allowed the French to sell alcohol to the Indians. That turned, quote, otherwise tractable Indians into homicidal maniacs, close quote, and Indian massacres were invariably about alcohol. Nothing can make the religious sacrifice of human beings by the Aztecs seem anything but evil to us. We are filled with horror when we find that they took pleasure in representing in their sacred art the victim biting clean through his tongue in the moment of agony, presumable since the greater the pain of the victim, the more the god would appreciate the sacrifice. Religion Without Revelation by Julian Huxley, New York, A Mentor Book, The New American Library, 1957, page 106. The effect they sought in alcohol was mystical and orgiastic, an illusion of godlike or demonic omnipotence that made them dangerous to themselves and to others. Typically, upon reaching a trading post, a band of Indian fur trappers would trade part of their catch for clothes, weapons, food staples, and a keg of rum. In council, they would then decide who could get drunk and who must stay sober to watch over them. The latter hid all the weapons, and the debauch began. As soon as the keg of rum ran dry, the orgiasts would exchange some more of their furs for another keg, and so it went until the last pelt had been exchanged. By then the drunken Indians would be in a state of frothing frenzy, and no matter how hard their sober companions might try to prevent it, almost always there would be a killing or two before morning. Then the survivors, nursing head-shattering hangovers, stripped of all their valuables, would drag themselves off into the forests again in quest of more animals to hunt. Ardent Spirits, page 38. When the Americans went to Belgium for the Congress of Vienna peace treaty in August of 1814, the British asked for an Indian buffer state in the Northwest that would be overseen by the British, and they also asked for the right to travel on the Mississippi and some other things, but the U.S. just said no. And in 1815, the British military announced that they were withdrawing from the Northwest, but continued selling arms to the Indians and encouraging them to make raids on the Americans, hoping the settlers would beg the British military to come back. In January of 1815, Andrew Jackson had been victorious over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, kicking the British out of New Orleans as a postscript to the War of 1812. And Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans saved America from the endless fighting between the British and the French. Thanks to Napoleon, the U.S. had doubled in size overnight in 1803. and some thought the U.S. was too big already, with Aaron Burr from Newark leading that charge, and more than a few people wondered if a large America could remain a democracy. Burr killed Hamilton in a duel in July of 1804, then tried to convince the West to become its own country, with Burr as its emperor, of course. And one of his friends informed on him to the government, and Burr was chased back to Europe after being found not guilty in a fair trial in 1807. Aaron Burr had wanted to stop Hamilton from having a Bank of the United States, and Burr thought Hamilton's bank would have competed with the Crown Bank, something the Founding Fathers had not considered because they believed commerce could only be done within a single banking system, and they had no intention of not continuing to do business with England. The Peace of Luneville in 1801 had been followed by the Peace of Amiens in 1802, but British saw them both as only a temporary breather in the war with France. So in 1803, Britain gathered all of Europe together to fight the new democratic revolutionary France, and the main cause of the continuing fighting in the Napoleonic Wars of 1802 to 1815 was over who should own Malta, which had been given to the Knights of Malta, but Britain had refused to leave there. When the British came to seize New Orleans, Andrew Jackson did such a good military job that only 8 Americans died, inflicting over 2,000 British casualties, and they also took 500 British prisoners, even though the war had been over for several weeks. But Jackson hadn't heard about that, and neither had his men. Andrew Jackson had been 13 years old during the War of American Independence, too young to join up with Washington's army, so he'd served as a mounted orderly and messenger. Andrew Jackson had 3 brothers, and the oldest had been killed in the American War of Independence, and Jackson was captured by the British along with his 16-year-old brother, and Jackson was cut in the head and the arm by a British saber when he refused to polish an officer's boots. The wound in the arm went to the bone, and his mother Elizabeth came to get him because the boys had contracted smallpox in the British prison. So the British let them go, but the boy died on the way home. The brother died on the way home. Andrew Jackson's mom went to free 2 of their cousins who were sick on board a British prison ship, and she died, and the British sent her clothes home with a note that she had been buried with the other plague victims. Andrew Jackson hated criminals and Indians, and he worked as a prosecutor, laying down the law and bringing miscreants to justice. Legend was that Jackson came up with the name Tennessee, and he gambled in land and stocks and slaves. And Jackson fought a duel and was shot in the chest, and the bullet had stopped next to his heart, and they had to leave it inside him where it would hurt for the rest of his life. The other guy had to stand on the mark and take his return shot, which hit him in the groin and killed him slowly and painfully. And Senator Benton would criticize the way Andrew Jackson seconded another duel, and Andrew chased him on horseback with a whip, and Benton ran inside a building while Jackson was shot in the shoulder. They almost cut off his arm, but Jackson survived because there were Indians to fight, and Jackson was a warrior. After practicing leading troops without authorization during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson kicked the British out of Florida without proper orders, and he cleared out the rest of the Spanish and the Indians. When he became president, Andrew Jackson got rid of what was left of the Indians in the Southwest, even though some of them had learned, the Southeast. He got rid of what was left of the Indians in the Southeast, even though some of them had learned to read and write and farm and vote. In Georgia, the Cherokee had become white men who could write their own language and had started their own schools and had set up an Indian government. And when Andrew Jackson told them to leave, the Cherokee took their case to the Supreme Court and won. But Jackson kicked out the Cherokee anyway, and these Indians were marched west, and 1/3 of them would die along the way, and it would be called the Trail of Tears. While the King of England was busy in 1800 trying to become the King of France, the French had taken back control of Missouri, where there were thousands of rich French aristocrats who had come to New Orleans during the French Revolution 10 years earlier. When the U.S. bought Missouri from Napoleon in 1803, Lewis and Clark were told to go check out the Louisiana Purchase, and Lewis would later become the governor of Missouri, and when they returned, Jefferson was too busy with the Aaron Burr trial to be able to hear much about their trip. President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out in 1804 with 3 boats and 43 men, among them a French fur trapper and his Indian wife, and Lewis and Clark were given $2,500 to go up the river. Lewis and Clark left from St. Louis on the 14th of May in 1804, and they named the 3 rivers forming the fork of the Missouri at 3 Forks after the President, the Secretary of State, and the Treasurer, who was a Swiss. And when Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific in 1805, they planted the American flag. The Indian wife was Sacagawea, or Bird Woman, and upriver they went until they could go no farther, and Lewis and Clark went ahead of the others with Sacagawea and her French husband, riding for 4 days until they found some Indians whose chief was Sacagawea's long-lost brother, which was a remarkable feat. In the first paragraph of History of the Expedition under the command of Captains Lewis and Clark, 1814, venereal disease was described among the Indians, and by the end of the 6th chapter of their report, venereal disease was listed as one of the afflictions of their own men. We therefore collected the chiefs and warriors, and having drawn a map of the relative situation of our country on a mat with a piece of coal, detailed the nature and power of the American nation, its desire to preserve harmony between all its red brethren, and its intention of establishing trading houses for their relief and support. It was not without difficulty, nor till after nearly half the day was spent, that we were able to convey all this information to the Chapunish, much of which might have been lost or distorted in its circuitous route through a variety of languages. For in the first place, we spoke in English to one of our men, who translated it into French to Chaboneau. He interpreted it to his wife in the Minnetaree language, and she then put it into Shoshone, and the young Shoshone prisoner explained it to the Chapunish in their own dialect. At last we succeeded in communicating the impression they wished, and then adjourned the council, after which we amused them by showing the wonders of the compass, the spyglass, the magnet, the watch, and the air gun, each of which attracted its share of admiration. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 281. Most of the men were in the habit of chewing tobacco, and such was their eagerness to procure it after so long a privation that they scarcely took the saddles from their horses before they ran to the cave, and were delighted at being able to resume this fascinating indulgence. This was one of the severest privations which we have encountered. Some of the men, whose tomahawks were so constructed as to answer the purpose of pipes, broke the handles of these instruments, and after cutting them into small fragments, chewed them, the wood having, by frequent smoking, become strongly impregnated with the taste of that plant. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 371 and 2. The noise awoke Captain Lewis, who instantly started from the ground and reached to seize his gun, but finding her gone, drew a pistol from his belt, and turning about saw the Indian running off with her. He followed him and ordered him to lay her down, which he was doing just as the Fields came up, and when taking aim to shoot him, when Captain Lewis ordered them not to fire, as the Indian did not appear to intend any mischief. He dropped the gun and was going slowly off as Drewer came out and asked permission to kill him, but this Captain Lewis forbid, as he had not attempted to shoot us. But finding that the Indians were now endeavoring to drive off all the horses, he ordered 3 of them to follow the main party who were chasing the horses up the river, and fire instantly upon the thieves, while he, without taking time to run for his shot pouch, pursued the fellow who had stolen his gun and another Indian, who were driving away the horses on the left of the camp. He pressed them so closely that they left 12 of the horses and continued to drive off one of our own. At the distance of 300 paces they entered a steep niche in the river bluffs, when Captain Lewis, being too much out of breath to pursue them any further, called out, as he did several times before, that unless they gave up the horse he would shoot them. As he raised his gun, one of the Indians jumped behind a rock and spoke to the other, who stopped at the distance of 30 paces as Captain Lewis shot him in the belly. He fell on his knees and right elbow, but raising himself a little, fired and then crawled behind a rock. The shot had nearly been fatal, for Captain Lewis, who was bareheaded, felt the wind of the ball very distinctly. Not having his shot pouch, he could not reload his rifle, and having only a single load also for his pistol, he thought it most prudent not to attack the Indians, and therefore retired slowly to the camp. He was met by Drewer, who, hearing the report of the guns, had come to his assistance, leaving the fields to pursue the Indians. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 355 and 6. 2 weeks after shooting the Indian, Lewis was hunting with someone named Cruzat, and was shot in the thigh because he was dressed like an elk. And the day before he had failed to make an entry in his diary, or maybe he wrote catch-up entries in the daily log, but the day after the accident there was a big thunder and lightning storm, and then Lewis didn't write again for 3 weeks because his wound had given him a fever. Lewis had described giving laudanum to the Indians on 2 prior occasions, so it may be supposed that he'd allowed himself some of the medicine. The men were generally afflicted with sore eyes, but the women had besides this a variety of other disorders, chiefly rheumatic, a violent pain and weakness in the loins, which is a common complaint among the females, and one of them seemed much dejected, as we thought from the account of her disease, hysterical. We gave her 30 drops of laudanum, and after administering eye water and rubbing the rheumatic patients with volatile liniment and giving cathartics to others, they all thought themselves much relieved and returned highly satisfied to the village. 3 days later we were visited by 4 Indians who had come from a village on Lewis's River at the distance of 2 days' ride, who came for the purpose of procuring a little eye water. The extent of our medical fame is not a little troublesome, but we rejoice at any circumstance which enables us to relieve these poor creatures, and therefore willingly washed their eyes, after which they returned home. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 297 to 99. We now resumed our medical labors, and a number of patients afflicted with scrofula, rheumatism, and sore eyes, to all which we administered very cheerfully as far as our skill and supplies of medicine would permit. We also visited a chief who has for 3 years past so completely lost the use of his limbs that he lies like a perfect corpse in whatever position he is placed, yet he eats heartily, digests his food very well, has a regular pulse, and retains his flesh. In short, were he not somewhat pale from lying so long out of the sun, he might be mistaken for a man in perfect health. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 282. About 11 o'clock, the day after giving laudanum to the hysterical Indian, a canoe arrived with 3 Indians, one of whom was the poor creature who had lost the use of his limbs, and for whose recovery the natives seem very anxious, as he is a chief of considerable rank among them. His situation is beyond the reach of our skill. He complains of no pain in any particular limb, and we therefore think his disorder cannot be rheumatic, as his limbs would have been more diminished if his disease had been a paralytic affection. We had already ascribed it to his diet of roots, and had recommended his living on fish and flesh, and using the cold bath every morning, with a dose of cream of tartar, or flowers of sulphur every 3rd day. These prescriptions seem to have been of little avail, but as he thinks himself somewhat better for them, we concealed our ignorance by giving him a few drops of laudanum and a little portable soup. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 300. The rain. The rain, which has continued for the last 10 days without an interval of more than 2 hours, has completely wet all our merchandise and spoiled some of our fish, destroying the robes, and rotted nearly 1/2 of our few remaining articles of clothing, particularly the leather dresses. About 3 o'clock the wind fell, and we instantly loaded the canoes, and left the miserable spot to which we have been confined the last 6 days. On turning the point we came to the sand beach, through which runs a small stream from the hills, at the mouth of which is an ancient village of 36 houses, which has at present no inhabitants except fleas. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 76. During the winter we'd been very industrious in dressing skins, so that we now had a sufficient quantity of clothing, besides between 300 and 400 pair of moccasins. But the whole stock of goods on which we are to depend, either for the purchase of horses or of food, during the long tour of nearly 4,000 miles, is so much diminished that it might all be tied in 2 handkerchiefs. We have, in fact, nothing but 6 blue robes, 1 of scarlet, a coat and hat of the United States artillery uniform, 5 robes made of our large flag, and a few old clothes trimmed with riband. We therefore feel that our chief dependence must be on our guns, which fortunately for us are all in good order, as we have taken the precaution of bringing a number of extra locks, and one of our men proved to be an excellent artist in that way. The powder had been secured in leaden canisters, and though on many occasions they'd been under water, it remained perfectly dry, and we now found ourselves in possession of 140 pounds of powder and twice that quantity of lead, a stock quite sufficient for the route homewards. Lewis and Clark, Volume 2, page 203. The notes that became the history of the expedition under the command of Captains Lewis and Clark were taken by Meriwether Lewis and published in 1814, and throughout the diary entries Lewis referred to himself in the third person. Smallpox and measles killed so many Indians that the U.S. government told them to stop the potlatches if they wanted to live, but more often than not the Indians had to be put in jail to stop the custom. Missionaries burned down our longhouses, said Donna, because they wanted us to live in single-family houses, close quote. As the settlers moved to the west, Cyrus McCormick invented the wheat reaper in 1834, and John Deere made a steel plow strong enough to tear up the prairie in 1837. And as Americans continued to grow more and more grain, the country drank to its heart's content as Americans went westwards, planting corn and making whiskey. Slaves were not allowed to buy or drink alcohol, so they smoked marijuana instead, and many workers in America were paid in liquor, not in cash. Kentucky had become the new paradise where farmers only had to work 2 hours a day to make a living, and the land was so good for farming that there was plenty of extra corn for whiskey making. Before the 1830s, Americans would take small frequent doses called drams, but they stopped that and began to engage in communal drinking, and then they started solo binge drinking while Europeans were still drinking drams. Europeans would tell the Cinderella story about a drunk lady turning into a pumpkin after drinking too late into the night and using her shoe as a glass, while politics in America was being decided by drunks in taverns and bars, and Americans drank more than the English, but less than the Scandinavians, and the Scots kept up with everybody.